Welcome everyone back to the workshop. We have now reached the final panel that really culminates, is a culmination of a lot of the ideas that we've been discussing up until now related to trafficking, smuggling, but also protection responses to mixed movement. And up until now, we have been speaking mainly about what should be done, key recommendations for policy and programming. And we're turning to discuss with this final panel how we can do it through advocacy. How can we effectively call for the changes that we have been discussing? So I would like to reintroduce, for those of you that were not at the morning keynote, our moderator for this final panel. Her name is Laetitia. She's the Horn of Africa Director at Human Rights Watch. She has investigated conflict-related abuses, including abuses against children and internally displaced persons in Somalia, and focused on issues of political repression, including the mistreatment of political detainees in Ethiopia and Eritrea. Her full bio is in the brochure of this workshop. So if I could ask Laetitia to unmute and turn your video on, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for joining for this afternoon session. I know the afternoon session is always a bit of a difficult one, but we have some really fascinating talks ahead. So I'll turn over to our first presenters from MSF in Libya, Suha Diab, Lucie Eches and Elsa Laino, who are going to be speaking a bit about their work with young people in Libya and making a case for broadening the definition of a child in this particular space and operating environment. So if I hand over to you now, thank you. Sorry, I should have probably given you a heads up. Please go ahead.
Just share my screen.
Lucie, would you like to try turning your video off, because the connection is quite weak?
Can you see my screen? No worry. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, but we don't. Yes, I think that sounded better.
Hi, hello again. Can you see my screen and hear me now? Okay.
We can hear you and see you.
Okay, perfect. Apologies for my connection that is not great from Misrata here now. Okay, so thanks again for the opportunity of presenting today. My name is Lucie. I'm the Protection Activity Manager for MSF in Libya, and I'm currently based in Misrata. As you mentioned, Laetitia, this paper was wrote with two of my colleagues, Suha Diab and Elsa Laino, who worked with MSF Libya protection team until very recently. So MSF has been working in Libya since 2011 with a specific focus on migrant since 2016. Considering the acute protection needs that our patients face, we have developed a protection management capacity. And this is from that the two case studies we are presenting today are based from. Before we start, I'd just like to say that MSF maintains that Libya is not a safe place for migrant and asylum seekers, and MSF reiterates that our call for evacuation to safe countries. And we believe that these two cases that we're going to present demonstrate that we as humanitarians are failing to protect them inside Libya with a specific focus on minors and youth.
Lucie, I think you're muted.
Lucie, we can see your screen, but yes, thank you.
I'm sorry. Sorry. Okay, so the first case study, the first case studies is based on MSF work in Dar el Jebel detention center. Dar el Jebel, for the one who don't know, it's a detention center that opened in 2017 and who is located 140 kilometers outside of Tripoli. In October 2020, it was announced that the detention center will be closed and that all remaining detainees will be evacuated to Tripoli and integrate into local communities in Tripoli. At the time of announcement, there was around 320 detainees, and when the evacuation and closure actually happened in January 2021, there was only 120 remaining, largely due to escape between October and January. So while working in Dar el Jebel, MSF identified 71 individuals who were minors when they first entered the detention center and who turned 18 while in detention. Hello again.
Hello, we can hear you now.
I'm so sorry.
No, not at all.
So I don't know where you lost me, but I was saying that those individuals who were children while in detention, they have received no child protection services while in detention, and they've been treated as adults. Also, they had very little access to their option to claim for family reunification in safe country, despite the fact that 40% of them said they had family link in safe countries. We as MSF were informed that 17 of these individuals, they were denied family reunification because they turned 18 while in detention. At the time of closure, again, they were treated and considered as adults because they were above 18. That means that they were transferred to Tripoli with the rest of the group with no specific support. Overall, the group, even for the other adult, not youth, they have receive very little services. And at this time, we cannot confirm that all of them have received assistance. So without underestimating the operational constraints that are faced in Libya in regard of this situation, we would like to highlight what it means for these youths and these minors who turn 18 while in detention to have been treated as adults. As I said, that means that some of them, since being 15 years old, even younger, they've been treated and considered as adults inside and outside detention center, both by the Libyan authorities as well as other humanitarian actors. And now, because they turn 18, they cannot access family reunification. So this has a double lifelong impact, both on their well-being as well as on their future plan. We believe that despite turning 18, they should have, we believe that despite turning 18, their time in detention and the trauma and the human rights violation they faced as children should have been considered to make them de facto a vulnerable group who should have then received higher protection, higher level of protection services while transferred to Tripoli. Now, in the second case study, we are going to see what happened or what actually happened when children are considered as children in Libya. So the second case study is based on MSF patient of our tuberculosis unit in Misrata. So in 2020, we have treated 14 unaccompanied minors recently released of torture hangar in Beni Walid. I would like to warn you that the upcoming images are quite confronting. This is one example of the patient we treat in our tuberculosis unit in Misrata. This is a patient of 15 years old, recently arrived, admitted from Somalia. As you can see, they are in severe medical condition. In addition to tuberculosis, they are severely malnourished, they have extended scabies, they show signs of violence, physical violence, and also signs of psychological response due to the ill treatment and torture they face for months. While they are under the care of MSF, they receive treatment for tuberculosis, malnutrition, and scabies, as well as psychological support. But once their treatment, the tuberculosis treatment is finished, there are very little option for them, despite the fact that I think we can all agree they would need sustained over a long period of time child protection services. But there is limited option of alternative care in Misrata because there is no community of the same nationalities currently living in Misrata. And in Tripoli, the available options of alternative care are very precarious. And we observe high protection concerns. We placed into alternative care option with child protection actors in Tripoli, 7 of our former patients of our tuberculosis unit. Out of those 7 patients, 5 of them are reported to be in extremely vulnerable condition currently in Tripoli. Because they were because they are minors, they have not accessed cash assistance. That means that they cannot meet their basic needs and they are very reliable or dependent on adult strangers. So their basic needs are unmet. We have observed during assessment visit in Tripoli that they had no access to food, they had no sleeping material or any NFI. Some of them also reported extortion from the very same community they are placed in by child protection actors. We've also observed, as part of our follow-up, the deterioration of their mental health due to precarious living conditions, lack of information regarding the resettlement process, and no follow-up from humanitarian actors. And not to mention the violence they face due to armed groups regularly entering those communities. So these are arguably the most critical child protection cases we can meet, and yet we are still unable to meet their needs. We believe that these two case studies, even though they are very specific, they are actually representative of the overall failure to do the minimum required to protect those children and youth. And we think that thus this can be classified as negligence. If MSF has really pushed and will continue to push for long-term solution outside of Libya, we would like to highlight the need for better protection services for these children and youth. While they are waiting for a safe option, they're going to be waiting for years and sometimes with no positive outcome outside of Libya. Protection or providing protection means reducing the risk. And in order to do that, we think we need to stop limiting ourselves with simplistic interpretation of principles and to deal with the actual reality as it exists now in Libya. But this means taking decisions where we will expose people to new risks, but that will reduce their overall risk of harm. And we know it's not easy to assume and to agree on that. A good example is cash for adolescent boys who are de facto exposed to violence, whether or not they received cash assistance. But with cash, they would be able to meet their basic need and to be less resilient on exploitative adults. Would be less reliant on exploitative adults. So overall, there is a massive unmet need for alternative care options for minors and youth in Libya. It is thus necessary to expand a broader range of options by evaluating the risk-benefit ratio, but from the perspective of the individual, not from the perspective of the organization. As MSF, we believe that as long a minor or a youth is in Libya, we should aim at the least worst option rather than avoiding action altogether. And that would be my final point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucie, for the pretty chilling presentation there. And I think a lot of food for thought, both in terms of programming, but I'm sure also a lot of questions there around, you know, what you see as some of the concrete gaps in the humanitarian response. You've touched on a number, but it will be good to dig into those a bit more. But in the meantime, I mean, maybe now to turn to our next presentation by Manon Radosta from the INGO Forum in Libya, who will be speaking more about the legal and social protection framework and also the gaps within that in the Libya context, and again, giving some concrete recommendations around reform there as well. So if I could turn over to Manon, thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, indeed, we're going to zoom out a bit. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you at this panel. So I'm Manon, Advocacy Advisor at the Libya INGO Forum, and I will be discussing the key gaps in protection frameworks for refugees and migrants in Libya. Jim, if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. This presentation is drawing on evidence, observation, and first-hand data collected by the 23 international NGOs that are members of the Libya INGO Forum, which I am representing today. A very short introduction of the forum first. So the LIF is an independent network of 23 international NGOs implementing humanitarian programs or in the process of setting up operations in Libya. As for the LIF Secretariat, which I am part of, we are composed of a team of 4 persons that are fully dedicated to support the coordination of the forum and currently hosted by the Norwegian Refugee Council, NRC. We focus our efforts mainly on 4 areas, which are coordination among the NGOs and within the humanitarian response, representation towards external stakeholders, advocacy and joint positioning, and areas of interest in information sharing, both internal and external. As you can see on the map, our members are operating throughout the entire country with main focus of activities in Tripoli, Misrata, Benghazi, and Sebha. As for the main activities, as you can see on the map on the right, they are mainly protection, health, and cash assistance for the main components. For the purpose of this workshop and specifically presentation, we won't be able to cover all aspects, of course, of protection frameworks, but I would really like to focus on 2 main points. The first one is the lack of basic safeguards, taking into account the impact of EU policies, which heighten the protection risk faced by migrants and refugees in Libya and negatively impact programs of humanitarian organization. The second one is the culture of systematic abuses in the country, and there I would like to put a focus on arbitrary detention and interlinked dynamics throughout the country. If you can go to the next slide, please. So first, I would like to acknowledge the fact that, as underlined many times the past days during the presentation and discussions, the gap here is again between the international and regional framework and the national legislation and practices. Libya did ratify a number of core international human rights laws instruments. And yes, it's not signatory to the Refugee Convention, its protocol, but the country has ratified regional instruments. And specifically, as written in the slide, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and the OAU Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. And both of them recognize the right to seek and receive asylum and prohibits expulsions. Also, it's worth noting that the interim constitutional declaration does embed the right to asylum. And yet, there is no national asylum system or procedures, and this convention, international and regional, have never been translated into the national legislation, and as such, then never been enforced. As it has been very clearly underlined also during this morning panel this time, the impact and responsibility of EU migration policies in hardening Libya's national framework is huge. The EU practice of externalization of its border control and overall external migration management have had a huge impact on all neighboring countries, and Libya is no exception. Historically, Libya was a major destination for labor migrants seeking employment in the country, specifically in the sectors of construction and oil, and the majority of these migrants were from African countries and did not require a visa. They were enjoying free access to healthcare, education, and other public services. But in the span of a decade, basically from 2000 to 2010, the government considerably hardened its migration policies to align with the EU agenda. And it was consecrated in 2007 by the reinstatement of visa requirements for African nationals, which effectively casted migrants into irregularity. And that led in 2010 to the law that is on this slide, which is the law number 19 of 2010 on combating illegal migration, and that did coincide with the adoption of a cooperation agenda with the EU to combat clandestine immigration. So this law is quite important because it de facto criminalized all migrants by defining the act of illegal migration as covering anyone who enters or stays in the Libya territories without authorization or permit from competent authorities with the intention of settling there or crossing to another country. What it means is that under this law, all foreigners who violate its migration provisions are criminalized and sanctioned with fines, imprisonment, and ultimately deportation, regardless of the nationality or country of origin. And this lack of distinction applicable to asylum seekers and refugees violates the right to international protection. We can't also fail to mention the progressively restrictive immigration practices focused on the interception at sea in the desert of the Sahel and returns to Libya that has helped also to create this world's deadliest migration route that the CMR is. On this graph, you can see that I featured the local migration governance. I think it's really important because in many contexts, with de facto control of different armed groups and territories and fragmented influence, practices vary a lot at local level, and the local migration government is sometimes more important than the national one. I will not have time to dig into this local aspect of representation, but I think it's really important to acknowledge this level too, and I am taking this opportunity to refer to a few recent research projects on this aspect that's a really important avenue for local advocacy and the promotion of best practices that could then be used as leverage or example of best practices at national level to promote policy shifts. What all of this means concretely is that protection space in Libya for migrants and refugees is extremely limited and keeps shrinking. What is quite striking, and at the same time, and reporting by organizations that are working on protection in the country, data collection and research on the entire region, is that neither these repressive measures nor the political or security instability the country is facing since 2011 are deterring migrants to come to Libya as a destination or a transit country. Refugees and migrants are still perceiving Libya as a viable destination that is offering better opportunities for livelihoods in their country of origins. And they do wish to remain there, either temporarily, but also permanently. This is one in country that migrants and refugees are confronted with the widespread abuses and really disproportionately affected by several types of protection incidents. If we can go to the next slide, please. I would like now to focus on the protection risks that migrants and refugees are facing, and specifically linked to the gaps in their legal protection that leads to their arbitrary detention and ultimately deportation. So this graph that you see on the slide, please don't take it as any official representation of how it works in Libya. The idea was really to put all elements on one slide to really underline how blurry and fluid it all is in the country. And here I would like to specifically draw your attention to a few points. The first one is discrepancy in numbers in official position. As I've written in the left part of the slide, the communicated numbers of detainees right now is very, very low compared to previous years. We are roughly at 1,000 people in official DCIM-run detention centers. So as of January 2021. And this does not include a couple of hundreds that are currently detained in the east in the 7 official detention centers. What this means is a few things. First, that many detention centers actually shifted under the control of non-state actors recently. That means that the detainees are not encompassed in this figure. There's only 12 official detention centers right now, and it was more than double not so long ago. Second is that a number of DCs are actually quite porous, and many migrants and refugees get in and out of detention for various reasons, which make it very, very difficult to track them. It can mean that these centers are semi-closed or semi-open, or that people get transferred from unofficial detention centers, or any other reason. And third, that thousands of migrants and refugees keeps being unaccounted for, specifically following the disembarkation and have gone missing. They've been either brought to unofficial centers or have managed to escape from the authorities. It's worth noting that in 2020 alone, there was more than 11,000 migrants and refugees that were intercepted at sea, and the majority of them were placed in some form of detention after being disembarked, so either state-run or unofficial centers without due process. But we can see very clearly that it doesn't coincide with the official numbers in the detention centers. What is also quite revealing is that when interviewed, migrants and refugees usually report that they have been detained up to several times during the years stuck in Libya, which definitely underlines, again, this fluidity of movements. We are also very cautiously optimistic about the official declaration of the government in the West, stating that they are in the process of closing all detention centers, especially as at the same time, there are larger centers in the center of the country that are said to be reopened and rehabilitated and could be presented as isolation facilities for migrants and refugees and no detention centers anymore, which is definitely a point of concern. This leads me to my second point, which is the kind of instrumentalization of COVID-19 that exacerbated protection risk and human rights violations faced by migrants and refugees in Libya. On a 6-month period from May to November 2020, protection organizations have observed an increase in mass arrest and deportation of migrants and refugees, specifically in the East. And we estimate now that there's around 30% of migrants that are recorded. And this is part of a campaign that has been launched officially by the authorities with an official decree to fight against communicable disease and COVID-19 by arresting migrants and all foreigners living in Eastern Libya. So medical tests are done by authorities, and then they're put in detention, and all persons having communicable diseases, and that also includes HIV, tuberculosis, or hepatitis, are put in detention and deported in the country of origin. Protection organizations have reported at least 36 mass arrests in this time frame, which takes a total of 2,300 migrants that have been arrested through mass operation in urban areas in the east. As for deportation from Benghazi to the country of origin of migrants and refugees, there's been a minimum of 23 mass deportation for a total of 1,500 migrants being deported to countries of origin, being mainly Egypt, Sudan, and Chad. And finally, a point on COVID-19 pandemic linked to the fact that it really increased discriminatory practices and stigma toward migrants and refugees, migrants being often presented as vehicle of this pandemic, which means that it's even more difficult now for them to access services they need, and it further constrained aid organizations' access to them. And that leads to my third and final point, which is the reduced and constrained access of aid organizations to migrants and refugees in detention centers and in urban settings. As I said, there's less and less organizations that have access to official detention centers, whether we're talking about the East or the West, and also to disembarkation points, with little to no capacity and ability to track migrants and refugees. And this is without even mentioning the thousands of migrants and refugees that we believe are currently being detained by non-state armed groups and smugglers, where no humanitarian partners have access to the sites. There is also no exhaustive knowledge of the location of these informal sites, number of people detained, the situation, and of course the needs. A small focus in the East again, because there is no plan for closure of immigration detention centers, and there is currently almost no alternative detention and limited access to international protection. We also want to emphasize the fact that there's a lack of actors that are actually able to provide assistance to migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers also out of the official detention centers. And this is due to strong restriction of access to migrants that are living in the eastern part of Libya, but also a drastic decrease of funding to the east. As a kind of summary of what I said, all that what I said before, is that until the legal framework related to migrants and refugees is broadened, revised, and incorporates ratifying existing international legal frameworks into domestic law and their applications, refugees and migrants in Libya will continue to be subjected to human rights violations, and all the more so because perpetrators are well aware of their vulnerability, lack of support, and inability to seek justice and redress. Also, migrants and refugees do receive only limited and insufficient support from an organization, as Lucie just said before me. And this is in part due to access restriction. As for refugees and asylum seekers specifically, it is also worth reminding that there is no official memorandum of understanding between UNHCR and Libya. This means that no specific access to education or health services is granted on the basis of possession of a UNHCR certificate, and the letters of attestation are not always recognized by Libyan authorities. All of this to say that there is really a strong need and urgent need for international community to advocate for the improvement of the protection states, which will require strong, coordinated, and high-level engagement for Libyan authorities and all purposes of de facto control of territory at both national and local levels. So far, the viable ways out of Libya, and other than risking crossing the Mediterranean, are dramatically insufficient, and migrants and refugees are in great need of assistance and protection, which includes alternatives to detention for those detained and prevention to detention for those in urban settings. Next slide, please. So based on all of the above, and you will find more details on the complete advocacy notes, our recommendation are threefold. And here we just extracted the one that we're linked to what I had time to present to you today. So first, the Libyan authorities and groups of de facto control of territory, which is mainly at national level. In particular, the authorities must commit to develop a national asylum system that will fairly and efficiently assess asylum claims, and thus will include adequate reception facilities, which cannot be detention centers. As a priority for 2021, there is also the need to ensure the formal recognition of UNHCR in the form of this memorandum of understanding that exists in other contexts, and that will guarantee UNHCR's full access to migrants and refugees across the country, with no restriction on nationality as it is currently the case. Third, to allow humanitarian agencies unrestricted access to all places where refugees and migrants are being held or disembarked, and also the importance of full transparency with regards to the migrants and refugees who are missing after segregation or transferred out of official detention centers. Fourth is to ensure that all arrests and detentions are carried out with due process and legislative safeguards. Protection organizations often report that detainees usually don't have any access to legal assistance. And finally, establish safe and regular channels for migrants to facilitate the entry and work opportunities. If you go to the next slide, this is our second set of recommendation, which is focusing on EU and member states. And here we have really renewed momentum, especially in the framework of the current political dialogue and process. We therefore urge them to fully commit to implement the outcomes of the Berlin conference that is explicitly calling for the European Union to support for initiatives to amend the Libyan legislative framework and to end arbitrary detention while establishing alternative procedures to detention. Then, as already stated before, Libya is not a safe port for disembarkation of people intercepted at sea. We therefore ask to stop financial and technical support to the Libyan Coast Guard and to strengthen search and rescue efforts in the Mediterranean Sea, to really focus on prevention of loss of life and compliance to the principle of non-refoulement. And finally, which is directly linked to the dramatically insufficient ways out of Libya, is to expand safe and regular entry channels for migrants and refugees to Europe. And I would like to finish the presentation with a last slide, which is a recommendation to aid organizations. As stated before, we really need to engage in comprehensive and high-level joint advocacy with Libyan authorities to improve protection space. We really have to adopt joint positioning and actions, especially because the protection space is so limited in the country. And following the current political developments, we can consider engaging jointly in a policy dialogue with authorities on a human rights-centered approach to migration management. Second, to continuously advocate with authorities to establish safe spaces for migrants and refugees and develop alternatives to detention. Then I would like to restate the importance of effective operational coordination, especially through the development and strengthening of referral pathways. This is something that came up, I think, during this entire workshop for the majority of contexts discussed during the whole presentation, and this is definitely something that is crucial to work on and to straighten. And finally, specific to Libya, is to really develop cross-sectoral initiatives that are linking protections, shelter, and multi-purpose cash assistance. The need for cash in particular is continuously cited as one of the main needs of migrants and refugees in urban settings, with the caveat, of course, of the liquidity crisis faced by Libya since several years now, but that could actually improve this year with recent development of the central bank. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manon, for your presentation. Let's hand over now to two presenters who will maybe take a slightly different perspective to the ones we've been hearing today, and I think you've also been hearing in the last few days. And we have two journalists who have been covering the situation in Libya for many years now, who will be joining to speak a bit about the role of the media in pushing for protection and protection advocacy for migrants and asylum seekers in the Libya context. So first, we will have Faraz Ghani, who is an Al Jazeera English online editor. And we will also be joined by Annalisa Camilli, who works with L'Internazionale, who will also be speaking to some of these issues. So let me hand over to you both now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, all. Annalisa, you want to go first, or should I start talking?
You can start. You can start.
Okay, all right. Hi, good to see you as well, Lisa. So basically, I don't have a presentation. Our presentation is basically our work that we put together, reporting on the movement, the migrants, the refugees, the asylum seekers and stuff. And I think it's important to talk about the need for reporting, and not just the need for reporting. I'd say the need for consistent and regular reporting, because what we see mostly in the media, and this is something that we've done as well, is reporting when there's an event taking place, reporting when there's a shipwreck, reporting when there's people drowning, reporting when somebody says something about the movements or you know, all the negative things that happened and reporting just based on that, and reporting the situation as just as stats. 20 people have drowned, 50 people were turned back. Since 2014, more than 20,000 people have drowned in the Mediterranean. So I think there needs to be a shift in the reporting that we do. I mean, I'm going to put my hand up and say that we used to do that as well, that report just when something happens. And that's why I think it was 2019, late 2019, I was on board the Ocean Viking together with Annalisa on a reporting trip. It was a difficult trip. I'm not a sea person. I was really seasick, but I think it was a good time to experience what these refugees and migrants go through. It was instead of sitting in the office and talking to people on the phone, talking to even these migrants and refugees through a third person, it was a good chance and a good opportunity to actually experience what these people experience, to be at sea. And I think the most important thing again was to actually talk to these people, not report them as a statistic, not report them 50 people rescued, 100 people rescued, but also talk about why these people make the journey. These people are fully aware of what's going to happen on the way to Libya. In Libya, once they aboard the rubber boats, what's going to happen on the Mediterranean, if they get rescued, if they get turned back, if they get detained, they know fully well. And despite that, they make that journey, which is quite interesting. And I think that the reason was to undertake that deployment that I took. And the reason to do the reporting that we do is to highlight the reasons behind the movement, the journey, why people leave home, why people make that journey, why people spend so much money making the journey that they may not get to this destination that they'd hope for. I mean, these people are fleeing poverty, conflicts, war, forced labor, FGM, corrupt governments, and even personal threats and stuff as well. And all they want to do is just survive and have a better life than what they're having right now. And I think this is something that gets missed during a lot of reporting that the mainstream media does, because again, I keep going back to this point, but it's really important that we focus on these people as human beings as opposed to just figures, because if you regard them as just figures, that's very insulting, and B, the readers won't get the context of why these journeys are taking place, why people are risking their lives, leaving their families behind, leaving their houses behind, leaving things behind, and leaving people that they may not ever see again. So it's quite important. That's what we try to focused on. That's what we continue to focus on as well. Speak to people on the ground, speak to the actual people that we're talking about, speak to the migrants, speak to the refugees, speak to people who've made the journey, speak to people who are thinking of making the journey to get to the roots of the issue, why people are leaving their homes, why can they not find jobs over there, or why can they not find stability over there, what they hope to achieve. A lot of times it's just peer pressure as well, as we all know. A lot of people on board the Ocean Viking, they told us that just because a neighbor's son made it to Europe, his parents force this kid to go as well, because if you can make it, you can make it as well, without realizing, but understanding what the situation was on board. So I think that's one of the reasons why we try and talk about the reasons, and we try and speak to the people, we try and give light to this story, and not make it seem like these people are just getting up for no reason, making that journey, spend a lot of money in most cases just to reach Europe and settle down there. So I think that's the initial bit that I want to talk about. I think I'm going to hand over to Annalisa now. She's going to talk about the tangible effects of the reporting that's been seen and witnessed.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure for me to join this high quality panel discussion. I've been covering migration in Italy in the last few years, focusing on the Mediterranean route and also the Turkey-Greece route, the Aegean route. And in this intervention, I would like to underline the role played by the press in the last few years, documenting what has happened along to migrants and asylum seekers along the Mediterranean route and in Libya. Numerous journalists from all over the world documented the situation along the Mediterranean route in these few years and in Libya. And some of the key information we have and the awareness of the situation there we have thanks to this deep investigation and research did by journalists and also with the support of NGOs and civil society also in Libya. In particular, starting in 2017, when Italy decided to sign this new deal with Tripoli in order to reduce the flow of arrivals in the Italian coast and to stop the departure of migrants from Libya, the Italian and the international press focused on this on the traffic in Libya and gathered thousands of testimonies of migrants suffering tortures, deep violences, inhumane treatment, rapes inside and outside the detention centers in Libya. Also in the official one, in 2017, a TV crew working for CNN, if I remember, has documented even an auction of migrants, covering with footage and pictures what many migrants told us in many testimonies, the reality of the trade of human beings among traffickers in Libya. Therefore, while the Italian authorities was considering Tripoli a safe place to send back migrants and asylum seekers, and were considering Libyan authorities someone who you can make a deal, evidences were displayed everywhere about another truth. Numerous investigations also documented the flow of money given by Italian and European government to Tripoli without any official control, being intercepted also by traffickers. In July 2017, when the flow of migrants arriving, especially in Italy, dropped dramatically. Numerous investigations discovered that Italian diplomacy was paying the Dabashi family, in particular in Sabrata, that at that moment was the main departure port in the west of the country. Therefore, the Italian authorities were paying some traffickers, some powerful local traffickers, in order to stop the departures. These traffickers were in the condition of receiving money both from migrants and at the same time from European authorities. And this was documented by Italian and European and international press. Also in the following years, the press, in collaboration with NGOs, with organizations of the civil society, documented the abuses of the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, these military units created after the Memorandum of Understanding signed in February 2017, founded by Italian and European authorities in order to patrolling the Libyan coast and pushing back the migrants and the asylum seeker after being intercepted at sea, rescued at sea. The Italian press succeed also to demonstrate that some traffickers were working with the Libyan Coast Guard, in particular in some places like Zawiya and Zuara, and that the Italian Navy and Coast Guards were coordinating the operations. These operations that, according to international law, are illegal, the pushbacks of migrants in a country that is not considered safe because it is not recognizing the the Geneva Convention on Refugees and other international convention on human rights, and where are documented so numerous and tremendous violation of human rights. But all this tremendous amount of investigation and researches and evidences basically did not have a great impact on policies. We can say it after 4 years of works, because in January 2020, in February 2020, the pact called Memorandum of Understanding was renewed automatically. And the request done by NGOs and also by some politicians, some members of parliaments in Italy, also by civil society, the request to cancel this memorandum or even to change this deal was basically ignored by the Italian government. According to various dossiers and studies done by independent researchers, Italy and Europe have given to Tripoli more than 700,000 euros since 2017. It was very difficult for journalists, for NGOs, advocates, and researchers to have access also to these numbers, because all this material was secrets, basically. Therefore, it was very, very difficult to gather all this information by every researcher and journalist who has worked on this dossier. And also, this big amount of money was given to Tripoli without any control by Italian and European authorities about the violation of human rights in the country, and also about corruption. Therefore, in some way, all this work of tens of journalists, a lot of journalists worldwide, was not useful and did not have impact, basically, from a general point of view. But we can observe also a sort of positive side effect, because in the course of these few years, the public opinion engaged with this situation in Libya, understood the situation in Libya. A lot of activists worldwide engaged in this, became more active on this issue. For example, in Italy, were created various networks of organization, NGOs, in order to do pressure on politicians, on members of parliaments, in order to change the policy of the country, the foreign policy of the country in Libya, but also to restore, for example, a national, governmental rescue operation at sea in the Mediterranean, along the Mediterranean route. It means that in some way the awareness of this situation in Libya and along this very dangerous route rise in the course of these years. especially in the public opinion outside the parties, but also in some parties, some members of parliament became more sensible to these issues. And if we can see a small result, a small impact, also if it's lateral, it's not the big issue was not changed, but there is a sort of side effect that this forced the Italian government to reform, to change the Italian migration law, a law that was changed by the far-right Minister of Interior Matteo Salvini in 2018, and then in 2019 a complex law that was changing the citizenship law and also the immigration law, but it was changed again in 2020. And it was introduced by Italian government after this strong campaign by NGOs, and this new law, this new immigration law introduced in 2020, introduced again a form of humanitarian protection for asylum seekers that was cancelled by the previous law, granting protection to those who are subjected to unhuman treatment in Libya. And well, I think, and also there is a reference to the pushbacks. This law underlined that it's illegal to push back people in an unsafe country, in a country where they risk to be subjected to violences, to torture. Well, I think that this is a small result, but it was possible because the awareness about the situation in Libya went mainstream in some way in the last few years, because a lot of people were working on it and was not was paying attention to what was happening on the other side of the sea in Libya, was tracking the money, also if it was very difficult, and did not stop to pay attention to the situation in Libya.
Thank you very much to both of you, both to Faraz to highlight the importance of making sure that the human stories are underlined, but to Annalisa as well to highlight that despite the difficulty of the advocacy and despite the fact that, as you mentioned, reporters and journalists have done such a good job at putting the evidence out there, it's been very difficult to shift policy makers' approach. But at the end of the day, that sensitization of the public is absolutely a key tool in these, but obviously also a difficult part of the puzzle as well to shift. So thank you both for that. We will now hand over to our next presenters, which will shift a tiny bit the discussion, but also very much in line with some of the questions we've been raising. I'll hand over now to Dr. Jean-Pierre Gauci and also Idel Hanley, who will be speaking to the issue and the tensions and dynamics between private vessels and states in the Mediterranean in recent times. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'll be doing the presentation and then Adele will come in for the discussion and the questions. So thank you very much, Laetitia, for the introduction, and thank you very much to everyone for the extremely interesting presentations, and to MMC and UNHCR for convening this. I suspect my presentation is going to be considerably drier than most of the others over the past 3 days, and especially this morning. But as Laetitia mentioned, what I would like to talk about is the role that private vessels play in the context of the rescue of refugees and migrants at sea. I'll be presenting a research that we finalized towards the end of 2020, which was done by the British Institute of International Comparative Law, which is where Idel and myself work, with funding and support from the Mirpuri Foundation. So just by way of context, and I don't think anyone here necessarily requires this context, but basically the role of private vessels when we talk about the rescue of migrants at sea needs to be seen within the broader context of the number of deaths at sea, the number of persons in distress at sea, which can both be linked back to this idea of a lack of legal pathways to protection. We also know, and I think Amira and Manon both mentioned this, that the search and rescue capability in the Mediterranean has been declining. Official state and official search and rescue capability by states has been declining. Instead, what we're seeing is an increased role for private vessels and an increased role for NGO vessels. I'm going to be focusing on private vessels, by which I'm focusing primarily or exclusively on merchant vessels. So I'm not talking about rescue by NGO vessels in this context. Obviously, part of the context is also the COVID crisis and how that has affected both the shipping industry and migration dynamics, including the closure of ports or providing a pretext for the closure of ports by countries like Malta and Italy. I should say, I am Maltese, and besides working at BICL, I'm also involved in an NGO based in Malta working on these issues. So the way Malta interacts in this context is also something that's very close to heart. And the final thing is, and this was something that came up when we're deciding whether to undertake this project, is the relevance of commercial and financial interests. And I said in the beginning that this presentation is going to be very dry, and part of that is because I will be talking about shipping contracts and such. But in practice, considering the important role that private vessels and merchant vessels play in the rescue of migrants at sea, looking at the implications on their bottom line, essentially on their financial situation, is something that becomes critically important. Now, the obligation to rescue at sea is something that's well established in international law. We can find it in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, in the Salvage Convention, the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, the Search and Rescue Convention, as well as a series of guidance and soft law issued by UNHCR, issued by the International Maritime Organization, and that is, as well as industry practice. So we see guidance that comes from the Chamber of Shipping, for example, as well, on the practice of rescue. But there's a very clear obligation for any master to rescue any person in distress at sea. And I think there's a number of things to keep in mind here. So the first is that the obligation to rescue, it doesn't discriminate on the basis of race, gender, nationality, status, etc. There is an obligation to rescue, and it's an obligation to rescue anyone at sea. The second thing to keep in mind is that the obligation to rescue is not an absolute obligation. So the obligation to rescue is subject to limitations, and the limitations vary depending on which instruments you look at. But basically, the general idea is that the master of the vessel needs to decide whether he can reasonably, without putting himself, his vessel, or his crew in danger, to rescue people at sea. And this is an obligation. The obligation to rescue generally is an obligation that's attributed to the shipmaster rather than to the particular vessel. And this is one of the areas which I think is quite interesting in terms of the kind of the way international law engages a particular private actor in this context. So what we do in this project is we looked at two sides of the same argument. So the first was looking at what are the human rights obligations of shipmasters or of vessels, and then the second was looking at the commercial implications. In looking at the human rights obligations, we looked at the application of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and we decided to do this partly because of the growing influence of the UN Guiding Principles, partly because of the link between the Guiding Principles and the now evolving Treaty on Business and Human Rights, and partly because we know that this is something that has been missing from the business and human rights analysis and literature and cases. Obviously, we focused on pillar 2, which is the pillar. So the UN guiding principles are divided into 3 pillars. The first looks at the obligations of states, the second at the responsibilities of business, and the third on remedies. So we focused on the second pillar, which is the responsibilities of business actors, because we were primarily interested in the responsibilities and role played by those private vessels. Under the second pillar, corporations, any corporation, including a shipping company, has an obligation to respect human rights. And when it talks about respect of human rights and violations of human rights, we see kind of this spectrum of 3 things. So one is human rights violation that is caused by the business. The second is where the business contributes to, and the third is where it is involved with it. And the obligation, the way the responsibilities align is a little bit different in those 3. So if it's a case where the private company is causing the harm, the responsibility is to seize immediately. Plus with contribution and being involved with, there's a kind of lower level of responsibility. But equally there, the obligation is to seize any contribution to that violation, as well as to apply leverage on the relationships that that company has with whichever other actor is engaging in behavior that's causing human rights violations. And obviously, the UN guiding principles apply to all human rights. And in this particular context, we taught primarily about the right to life. Basically, the obligation to rescue is in part an extension of the right to life, or a manifestation or a positive obligation under the right to life, as well as the prohibition of non-refoulement. So with regards to the right to life, there's a number of different things. So one is the obligation to actually rescue, but the second is the obligation to actually be prepared to rescue, to have the necessary equipment, to have the necessary training for your staff, for crew, to be able to undertake those rescues. When it comes to the prohibition of non-refoulement, here the relationship with the state that is giving the instruction to rescue and the instruction of where to return people becomes even more active, even more important. And that is basically in the Mediterranean context, instructions, for example, to return people to Libya. And we've seen a number of cases, and there's a number of cases in front of international tribunals and international courts at the moment looking at some of these issues from the legal standpoint. Obviously, one of the key issues that the UN guiding principles kind of tiptoe around in some ways is what happens when a business is instructed to do something that would result in a violation of human rights. Clear example in the Mediterranean, the Maltese authorities, the Italian authorities, any other authorities give an instruction to a rescue vessel to return people to Libya. And the guiding principles effectively stop short of saying you can ignore that instruction or you can ignore that particular provision. But they do provide that you should exercise leverage, for example, to convince the state or to change the legal framework, for example. So that's just one part of the human rights responsibilities of business in this context and of private vessels in this context. So besides human rights angle, and I'm happy to go back to some of those discussions, we also looked at commercial implications. And here we talk about both direct and indirect costs. So direct costs include, for example, additional fuel that the vessel is going to use in order to rescue people. But indirect costs include things like what happens because of the delay of the vessel in that particular context. What happens if there is a time charter party? Is that time considered to be active or not active, which also translates into should the fee essentially under the charter party continue to be paid for the time that the vessel is rescuing people. And I think here the kind of link to states becomes active again because we've seen a number of incidents, and part of the inspiration for this project comes from the MT Salamis incident back in 2013, where vessels are denied entry to port, where vessels are not allowed to disembark people, and there's significant delays. And obviously we have the example of the Maersk Etienne in September 2020, where we exceeded any record of delay to disembark. Obviously, some of those costs will be covered by the charter parties. Some of them will be covered by the rules of carriage of goods, depending on the relationship between the ship owner and the charterer, so what sort of agreement is in place. And in the report, we actually go through some of the kind of provisions that are available in these model agreements. Obviously, these agreements are all subject to freedom to contract, which means that they can change, but there are some very kind of well agreed model provisions that are always included under the NYPE 1946, for example. Some of the costs are also covered by insurance and P&I clubs. However, even there are limitations to what is covered and in what context is it covered and how long is it covered for. So one thing that we see is that there are significant commercial implications for private vessels to rescue. And what that translates to effectively isn't necessarily not rescuing, but it is a kind of a disincentive to rescue. But also most of these commercial implications do not necessarily come from the rescue itself, even if a rescue in itself can cause delay. It mainly comes from the failure of states, of coastal states in the most part, to allow vessels to disembark the people that they have rescued. So this brings us to the role of the state. And obviously we're talking here about both flag states and coastal states. So flag states are, as many of you will know, the only state that has the state that has jurisdiction on a vessel on the high seas is the flag state, which is the state where it is registered. And the flag state has a due diligence obligation. So under UNCLOS, under the SAR Convention, under the SOLAS Convention, flag states have an obligation to make sure that masters of vessels flying their flag do rescue people at sea and are prepared to rescue people at sea. That includes basically making that a provision in their law and enforcing the provision in their law. And obviously, whilst we see most countries do have these provisions in their laws, and we go through a number of examples in our report, we also see that in practice, it's very difficult for those provisions to be enforced and very effectively. Now, when it comes to the responsibility of the flag state isn't necessarily liable because a vessel didn't rescue people at sea, but it is liable for not doing its due diligence to make sure that the vessel rescued people at sea. And whilst we don't have a decision by ITLOS, which is the International Tribunal, specifically on rescue at sea, we can draw a parallel here with the decision by the same tribunal in the IUU fishing case. We then have the coastal states, and obviously coastal states go and SAR states go in both directions, obviously both north of the Mediterranean and south of the Mediterranean. But what we see is an obligation on coastal states for cooperation and coordination for the prompt disembarkation. International law does not provide for a default state of disembarkation. There are some provisions in soft law that imply that SAR states, for example, should allow disembarkation, but those are based on amendments to legislation, to instruments that countries like Malta, for example, have not accepted. But there is definitely an obligation to cooperate and coordinate for the prompt disembarkation. Coastal states can also have responsibility for human rights violation, both in terms of the instructions to return. So, for example, the case that we see in front of the treaty bodies about the MV Niven case from last year that was, 2019, that was brought against Italy, because obviously it is Italy that is the subject to that treaty body and not the vessel itself. The other way in which coastal states can be responsible for human rights violations is if they delay disembarkation and the conditions on board deteriorate to the point where they become akin to cruel and inhumane treatment for persons on board. Obviously, as I said, disembarkation is the key issue here. So one of the issues is the need for cooperation and coordination, the role of coastal states. And obviously there have been recommendations made in various fora, including by some of those coastal states, obviously, for flag states to take on responsibility. It's a big question mark the way flag states can be involved. I will say this, that one of the key arguments is, oh, flag states are very often very far away. I don't necessarily think that that argument works, because just because you allow disembarkation in the physical territory right away doesn't mean that that can't be on the basis of an agreement for those people to be then relocated or flown off essentially to another country where their asylum claims can be processed, etc. So coming to the recommendations, and I appreciate that I think I'm running out of time. So the first is an integrated approach to migration at sea and to rescue of migrants at sea based on a good faith efforts by all. And by good faith, I also mean taking into account the human rights obligations of everyone involved. The clarification and formalization of rules for disembarkation, avoiding the use of disembarkation as a lobbying tactic, or the denial of disembarkation as a lobbying tactic. So we've seen this in the Mediterranean, again, with Malta, for example, saying, oh, we're not going to allow people in until other European countries offer to take the people that we are disembarking. This isn't to say there shouldn't be that form of solidarity, but it is to say that the people being stranded at sea should not be used as a tactic for lobbying for those that form of solidarity. Assisting masters in order to reduce delays. That might also mean transferring people from a rescue vessel onto a state vessel. For private vessels to use their bargaining power, obviously, whilst there's a lot of NGOs, etc., engaging in this field, actors have strong bargaining power because of the commercial interests that they bring and the financial contribution that they make to countries. Also using bargaining power from flag states to work with coastal states in terms of ensuring that vessels registered in those flag states are not being pushed to violate human rights. Development of model clauses in order to clarify the sharing of financial costs between different actors, so a charterer, for example, and the ship owner, as well as the creation of a compensation fund. And we've seen this done in other fields, so we think that there's some learning that can be done also in this particular field. The other side of this is facilitating access to information about what instructions are being given, what is happening with those instructions, in order to ensure accountability for all the actors involved, whether that is the private vessels or coastal states or other states. And then from a more kind of analytical perspective, we think there's a need to mainstream business and human rights in the shipping research and the shipping industry more generally, and the need to mainstream shipping into the business and human rights literature. And I think I'll stop there, but obviously happy to take any questions and comments and take it from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. And I think it will be great when we open up for questions as well. I mean, to get your thoughts, you've made a few recommendations there at the end, but in terms of where the advocacy in this field should focus, whether we should be talking about really trying to move the legal framework forward, but also maybe insights into who is engaging with the business community and advocacy at that level as well. So that would be great. Just before I turn over to our next presenter, I just want to mention that there has been a request to basically maintain the Q&A in a live stream mode. So if anyone has any concerns about that, we have 2 more speakers before we get to the Q&A, but maybe let Ayla know. You can direct message her if you have any concerns about this remaining in live stream mode. Thank you very much. So it's now my pleasure to hand over to Nahom Gebremeskel, who works with Mixed Migration Center in Tunisia, who is himself from Eritrea, has his own personal perspective to bring, but is also working, speaking directly with a lot of the individuals who we are speaking about and for whom, in theory, the protection efforts are focused at. So let me hand over to Nahom. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello. I think is my voice clear? Okay. So first of most, I would like to convey my greetings and express my gratitude to those who have aided me with this opportunity. My name is Nahom Brook Gebremeskel, my full name. I am a refugee from Eritrea, in North Africa, as a monitor since December 2019, and conducted plenty of surveys, questionnaires in different cities of Tunisia, as well as remotely in Sudan. While conducting the surveys, I came across many migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, who majority of them traveled through the central Mediterranean route, which enabled me to have fundamental understanding of the prevailing challenge encountered by such people, in addition to what I learned from treacherous personal experience of mine on this route. Given the fact that this is a very broad topic, it's not possible to fully express the details of these routes in such a short time and small report. Hence, I decided to summarize my presentation, focusing mainly on protection and smuggling issues in 3 countries, which is Sudan, Libya, and Tunisia. So I will start with Sudan. And like what I said, it may be difficult to fully express all the details. And okay, so starting with Sudan, many West African migrants crossed the border to Sudan from Chad, during which they mentioned they became victims of physical violence and robbery at gunpoint by armed groups and criminal gangs. During their stay in Sudan, many of these migrants reported that they struggled a lot to have access to work and other social services due to the following reasons. The first one is lack of proper documentation. The second one is language barrier problem, fear of detention and deportation by authorities, and discrimination, and also some other problems, of course. Due to the above reasons, those migrants are often left without a choice but to be engaged in an underpaid labor jobs. Concerning migrants from the Horn of Africa, such as Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, entering Sudan could be either with or without the help of smugglers, which most of the time, one way or the other, end up with a story of being locked up and tortured in a warehouse of smugglers in the middle of desert in Sudan, or areas like El Hajj for a ransom, which mainly is because these smugglers used warehouses to take their money. And after such extortion, living in Sudan becomes challenging because of the same reasons affecting West African migrants, in addition to an arbitrary roundups and detention by the authorities, by the local authorities. To avoid such kind of roundups or to get released from the detention in case arrested during these roundups, East African migrants, especially Eritreans, bribe those in charge. The main reason why specifically Eritreans use such method to get released is, according to the testimonies, they reveal the failure to do so, it often results in forced Eritrea. So as we can simply imagine, this bribery is just a momentary solution. Hence, looking for long-lasting ones becomes the inevitable. So in such circumstance, smugglers are the only choice most of the time to travel, because most of these Horn Africa migrants do not possess legal documents to proceed with their journey. Okay, so the second one is Libya. As we all know, for the past 3 or 4 years, majority of African migrants attempted to cross Mediterranean Sea, embarking from Libya. While stating that almost all respondents mentioned that they became victims of some or all sorts of violence and abuses in Libya, I will narrow down my focus on the route used by migrants from the Horn of Africa. Okay, so to enter Libya with the help of smugglers departing either from Egypt or Sudan, which is most of the time the case, one has to travel through the Sahara Desert. If one is fortunate enough, which is rarely the case, the journey will take a few days or a few weeks. Otherwise, it's a couple of months. Traveling in compacted vehicles with scarce water and food supplies amid the harsh environment whose temperature goes above 40 degrees centigrade, not to mention the violent treatment of the smugglers, the possibility of making it alive to Libya is greatly reduced. And which is why every year high number of migrants lose their lives on this journey because of thirst, hunger, dehydration, car accidents, and exchange of fires between the smugglers and the kidnappers who wants to take these migrants from the smugglers, and some other factors also. So many, if not all of these who arrived to Libya reported that they were told to pay ransom more than the deal they had in the first place. Some also reported that they were kidnapped to come to Libya in the first place, and were kidnapped to come to Libya in the first place, and they were asked to pay ransom that they never thought of. Whether one came with one's will or not, once trapped in the hands of the smugglers, it's obvious that there will be tortures, including but not limited to beatings, rape, starvation, splashing with water in cold nights, electric shock, poor medical supplies, which is why many migrants end up dead in the warehouse before or even after paying the ransom they were demanded to pay. In many cases, this is the first link in the succeeding chains of warehouse tortures. Smugglers extract money and sell migrants to earn money twice from the same detainees. After passing through such cycle of torture, some of these already traumatized and victims of SGBV or the sexual and gender-based violence, they try to cross the Mediterranean Sea to just end up being intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guards and detained in detention centers run by the Libyan authorities, which is from which UNHCR carries out evacuation to one of the transit countries or to resettlement countries. So these detention centers are known for their poor management in terms of the medical and food supplies, as well as their safety and security, because many migrants are reported to have been taken out and consequently sold to smugglers from the same detention centers. Migrants, which are all fed up of these situations, sometimes escape from these detention centers and they start living in Tripoli city, this city which relatively is in Libya. However, being safer city than other cities doesn't make Tripoli a safe place. Instead, it's a place where migrants are often exploited, robbed, and robbed at gunpoint, and even murdered, according to some reports. Okay, and the third part is Tunisia. So the absence of proper documentation and asylum law hinders refugees and asylum seekers from having any permit to work, study, or have access to any social services, because the asylum card or the refugee card grants only limited authorization. So addressing this problem, humanitarian organizations such as UNHCR shall advocate more for durable solutions, as well as collaborating with national and international organizations shall work more towards creating activities where expats can sustain self-esteem during their stay. In addition to my personal experience, analytical reasoning of the surveys I conducted with plenty of migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees from many African migrants for more than a year in the south of Tunisia has enabled me to disclose that discrimination still exists, and hence the interference of authorities, local authorities, to devise means of smoothing the relationship between local communities and expats is crucial. So traumatized migrants naturally have less capability of dealing with certain circumstances than those who didn't go through such kind of trauma, or those who didn't experience trauma. After passing through perilous journey, it's hard to catch up normally unless psychosocial assistance is provided. Many migrants are not able to have such services in Tunisia for not having proper documentation. Some cannot afford it, and some don't really understand the essence of psychosocial support. So addressing such kind of issues and try to devise any kind of solutions is important. So I hope that I conveyed a certain message on my behalf and many others like me. And I would gladly accept any comments or questions or even corrections for points I might have missed. And once again, I express my sincere gratitude to MMC North Africa for entrusting me with this task. It's an honorable moment for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nahum. And I think also you raise important concepts there around safe, safer, what is a safe space, but also what is a safe space, of course, to provide key medical assistance to populations who have been through so much trauma as well. So I think this comes back also to the whole presentation by Lucie at the beginning of this session. So now I will hand over to Sylvain Astier from the Swiss Embassy in Tunisia, who focuses on migration, the migration delegate, to open up for our discussion. And then I will start taking questions as well. And I know there's been a few questions that have been placed in the chat already, so I will come back to them, but I will start by opening up to participants who want to take the floor after Sylvain. Thank you very much.
Merci Laetitia, je vais parler en français et je serai assez bref étant donné qu'on est un peu en retard. Je crois que c'était très intéressant ces différentes interventions et ça prouve que la Libye, notamment, la Libye est un environnement très complexe où des solutions immédiates ne peuvent pas être trouver d'emblée, et il faut rechercher des solutions en fonction des personnes qui sont en Libye, en tout cas en fonction des migrants ou des réfugiés. Ainsi donc, on a entendu parler de MSF concernant les évacuations humanitaires pour les personnes qui en ont besoin. Donc, bien sûr, les États dont je fais partie acceptent de prendre quelques personnes qui ont besoin, qui sont vulnérables, mais bien sûr, comme je crois le HR le dit, on ne pourra pas prendre toutes les personnes vulnérables qui sont en Libye. Et c'est pourquoi, malheureusement, il faut faire un choix et normalement, on se concentre sur les personnes qui ont des besoins les plus immédiats au niveau de la vulnérabilité. Ce qui est également très important, c'est par rapport au pull factor, parce qu'on a compris aussi avec le HR, je pense, que les centres de détention, à l'époque, menaient pratiquement immédiatement à une réinstallation, resettlement, parce que les conditions étaient horribles. Et comme il a été mentionné, les journalistes ont beaucoup reporté sur les conditions horribles qui sont toujours présentes dans les centres de détention en Libye, et donc qui a favorisé le fait de prendre des personnes qui étaient en détention pour les réinstallations, c'est-à-dire de les prioriser. Or, on a pu constater que ça pouvait avoir un pull factor, comme l'a dit Naom. Donc, il y a des réfugiés qui viennent de Libye pour aller en Tunisie, mais en Tunisie, les possibilités de réinstallation sont très très minces. Donc, finalement, ça pousse certains migrants à retourner en Libye pour être pris dans un centre de détention et envisager une réinstallation. Je crois que c'est aussi Vincent Cochetel qui l'avait mentionné. Et personnellement, je connais un Tchadien que j'avais rencontré dans un centre du HR à Medellín qui est reparti à Zaouïa et qui est maintenant à Malte. Donc, ça arrive. Et c'est pourquoi, encore une fois, on ne pourra pas considérer tout le monde dans la réinstallation. Et puis, ce qu'il faut aussi dire, c'est que, comme l'a mentionné la représentante de MSF, il y a des personnes, ils ont un besoin immédiat d'être évacués de Libye parce qu'ils subissent des problèmes médicaux, ils ont des problèmes médicaux. Et là, la réinstallation prend beaucoup de temps puisqu'on doit normalement les évacuer vers un ETM, donc au Niger, au Rwanda, et pas forcément directement, ils n'ont pas le temps, ils ont besoin d'une solution immédiate. C'est pourquoi HR bon, la Suisse ne le fait pas, mais soutient les évacuations humanitaires, qui est une bonne solution immédiate. Et la Suisse ne fait pas des évacuations humanitaires, mais peut, pour certains cas dont la vie est menacée immédiatement, en Libye, donner des visas humanitaires. C'est prévu dans la loi suisse et ça permet d'avoir une certaine flexibilité et de sauver des vies. Ce que je voudrais aussi mentionner, c'est qu'on a beaucoup parlé du sauvetage en mer et Naom l'a un peu mentionné sur la traversée du désert. Il y a beaucoup de morts sur le désert et là, encore une fois, peu de documentation par les journalistes. Pourtant, il semble qu'il y a presque autant de morts dans le désert, voire plus, que dans la mer Méditerranée. Et le sud de la Libye, le sud de la Libye est également une grande zone de trafic où on n'a pas des centres de détention officiels où le HR ou l'OIM peuvent aller. Bien sûr, l'OIM a des bureaux, je crois, à Koufra et à Saba. Ce sont des employés locaux qui n'ont peut-être pas, et qui vivent dans la communauté, qui n'ont peut-être pas la distance qu'il faut pour pouvoir alerter la communauté internationale. Et c'est pourquoi, là, la Suisse aussi aimerait bien, mais les conditions de sécurité ne le permettent pas, ce serait d'encourager les organisations internationales à renforcer la présence au sud, à Saba, à Koufra. On a entendu, je crois que c'est très connu, les déportations de migrants vers le Tchad, vers le Soudan, sans absolument aucune vérification qu'ils ne sont pas menacés ou que leur intégrité physique n'est pas menacée. Ça, c'est des choses qui sont très préoccupantes et qu'il convient également de traiter et qui est insuffisamment traité actuellement au niveau de la communauté internationale qui se concentre principalement sur Tripoli et un peu l'Est. Et pourtant, à l'Est, comme on le voit à Koufra, qui est considéré comme la Cyrénaïque, il y a beaucoup de choses qui se passent et dont on n'est pas témoin. Encore un petit point, si vous permettez, Laetitia, c'est sur le rôle des journalistes qu'on a discuté. Donc, je partage entièrement les points de vue qui ont été développés. Simplement, j'aimerais bien mentionner un point que j'ai constaté, et c'est pas Vincent Cochetel qui me contredira, mais certains journalistes ont fait aussi leur business de raconter des histoires. Et des fois, on a des preuves que les journalistes sont en contact avec WhatsApp, avec des personnes qui sont en centre de détention, et en les encourageant à même rester dans le centre de détention pour pouvoir continuer à transmettre ce qui se passe. Et ça, c'est relativement grave parce que c'est plus du journalisme, mais c'est de l'activisme qui, en plus, met en danger des populations et met en danger les migrants et les réfugiés. et finalement aussi perturbe toute la stratégie qui est mise en place par la communauté internationale et les organisations internationales pour éviter des drames qui se sont passés comme à Tajoura lorsqu'il y a eu le bombardement de ce centre de détention. Voilà un peu mes réflexions que j'ai eues par rapport à toutes les discussions qui, encore une fois, sont très, très intéressantes. Merci beaucoup.
Merci bien, Sylvain. So I will now open up to questions, and I will call on Mirko, who I think had hand raised before. I'm not sure if you still want to come in at this point, Mirko.
Yes, if I may. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Okay, because I'm joining by telephone. Yeah, good afternoon to you. My name is Mirko Kreibich. I'm the EUTF for Africa, North of Africa window. And I would like to actually make 2 points, maybe very brief on the very first presentation by MSF. So I think the question of specific vulnerabilities and needs of minors and also young adults has also been recognized by us and seen. And I can tell you that we've just signed a new action or contract to a new action on family reunification and protection of minors together with UNHCR that has started implementation in January. It's not a huge action, but it's an action that is mainly focused on Libya and Egypt, and aims to reduce also trafficking of children, but also risks associated to secondary movements, and of course also family reunification. Now coming to the main point that I wanted to make. First, let me say that I'm an operational person, so I cannot really comment on the whole policy context. I cannot comment on what member states do, resettlement questions, search and rescue, and so on. But more on the operational side, and especially what we from the EUTF and EU operations do, and specifically in Libya. I think what we first have to see is that Libya is simply a fragile, in parts maybe even failed state at war. So all we see, all we know is of course horrific, and most of what we have actually heard today is well known also in the EU, but it comes maybe also to a large extent with the fact that we are here talking about a failed or failing state at war. Now we have to see how we can actually change this context. As to the EUTF, I would like to, in fact, maybe tackle a few misperceptions that are commonly quoted and shared about EU action in Libya specifically, and of the EUTF. Let me start by saying that the EUTF is by far the largest humanitarian and development action instrument in Libya. We have, over the past 5 years, approved actions worth more than 455 million. And this is, I think, very important. More than half, about 230 million, or even more than 230 million of these actions are in the area of protection. So the EUTF is by far the largest protection instrument in Libya. Now, we have, for example, contributed significantly to voluntary humanitarian returns of 52,000, more than 52,000 migrants. So without the EUTF, the figure would have been much, much smaller. And we have also funded together with the UNHCR, by the way, the humanitarian evacuation of almost 6,000 vulnerable people to the emergency transit mechanisms in Rwanda and in Niger. There is also the whole question of working on humanitarian action, such as in the health sector, non-food items, and so on. So I think it has to be recognized also by NGOs, media, and so on, that the EUTF is really a large instrument that also, and mainly, actually, supports Libya with humanitarian action. Now, coming to another question on the border management. Again, some misperceptions also I've seen in the paper of the colleague from the Libya INGO forum. Now, first of all, it's actually a no-brainer, but I would like to state that saving lives at sea is a humanitarian imperative. And our support to border management is in this line. It has to be seen in this line. Our main aim with that is to save lives at sea. Now, other than stated in the paper, our exposure, our portfolio on border management is currently 57.2 million, which is about 12.5% of the overall amount that we actually have engaged in Libya. So it's by far not the largest amount. And the Libyan Coast Guards, that is true, is among the beneficiaries, but not the only one. And actually, we have just signed a second contract. The first contract has seen some delays, and I can tell you that we have not so far provided any naval assets to the Libyan Coast Guards. And you can see that they are still doing search and rescue. And I think this is also an important thing to acknowledge, that the Libyan Coast Guards are, to what we know, only reacting to distress calls. So by definition, legally what they do is search and rescue operations. So they have an obligation to do this. Yeah. And I think they are also doing it fairly well. Within all the challenges that you face in such a context. Now,
Mirko, could I just ask you to wrap up so we allow for a bit of a discussion? Thank you.
The last two sentences on the recommendations by the Libyan INGO Forum. I think we are all absolutely okay with that, but I can also say that we have done advocacy along these lines at various levels over the years, again and again. Finally, maybe I think we have to be careful not to mix, say what some member states are doing at the bilateral level and the EU money. And by the way, the EU is actually very transparent about all of it, and we have actually answered dozens of access to information document requests. That's me from my side. Over. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I'll hand over to Vincent.
Thank you very much, Laetitia. And a couple of points, and thank you for all the very good presentation. Maybe to now, just to say on Tunisia, I think maybe to correct one point that maybe was not clear. I mean, refugee can eventually get work permit today in Tunisia. Some have got legal work permit, even in the absence of asylum legislation. So we need to recognize some efforts that are made by the authorities to improve the socio-economic insertion of refugee, but it's just the beginning. I think generally on the first two presentations, I would emphasize also the Libya's obligation. I think I heard that Libya has no refugee obligation. Well, Libya has ratified the OAU Convention relating to refugees. It has ratified all international human rights instruments, and it has obligation both under GNA controlled territory and in the east. You know, as we speak during this seminar, 120 Sudanese have been expelled without any form of due process by the authorities in Al-Kufra to Sudan, to a place where they can't be reached. So we need to step up advocacy, a balanced advocacy on both sides of Libya. also point to the obligation of African Union states in terms of protection of their nationals trapped in trafficking in Libya. And I don't think they do enough in terms of advocacy efforts with the Libyan authorities, again, on the both sides of the political spectrum. Finally, on the very good, and thank you, Jean-Pierre, presentation. It was indeed technical, but let me reassure you, it was not dry. I appreciate that you brought back that this idea of a trust fund to compensate some boats that would be derouted for rescuing people at sea. Such a precedent exists in the Sea of China during the movement of Indo-Chinese refugees in the 80s. So that's an interesting reminder. What I'm a bit concerned about is the total lack of accountability mechanism for boats refusing to rescue, the lack of accountability mechanism for boats switching off their anti-collision device on their radar in order not to be called by a rescue center. And I'd like maybe to point here at maybe some specific responsibility that we could trigger with certain part of the business industry, meaning the oil industry. In the Libyan territorial water, or just outside the Libyan territorial water, you have several European companies operating with different companies to operate supply boats to petrol platforms. And those people see people in need of rescue, and it's only very rarely, mainly some linked to Shell, but very rarely that those commercial operators have rescued people. And I think they have a specific responsibility given the access they have to Libyan resources. I'd like also to point to that dysfunctioning, which is not new in maritime business, about the capacity of many boats, many carrying African flags, in the Libyan territorial water, or in what we call the Libyan SAR, boats that constantly flag, deflag, reflag, and avoid any sort of obligation in terms of rescue for a number of years, while it's known they are on certain routes and carry certain goods. The last point is, and I know that's a point that MSF has raised, is when we know that the dimension of the Libyan SAR is totally unrealistic, what are the implications in terms of international law of such an oversized and artificial SAR, when we know they don't have the capacity or the intention to exercise SAR responsibility so far away from their shore. If you have any idea, I'd be very interesting. But very many thanks to all the panelists. It was very rich and enlightening.
Jean-Pierre, do you want to come in to respond to some of those questions? And then it would be good maybe to come back to Lucie and Manon also a bit to discuss. I mean, Lucie, you clearly expressed, I think, a bit of frustration in terms of the humanitarian community's willingness to think a bit outside of the box when it came to categorization of vulnerable populations. I think it would be good to speak a bit to that more concretely, and then maybe also come into the discussion which Manon raised about the importance of collaboration in terms of advocacy amongst humanitarian organizations.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Obviously, really interesting points, and I think I agree with all of them. I think this issue of lack of accountability for vessels that fail to abide by their responsibility to rescue is critical. And there, I think it is the responsibility of flag states, but it's also the responsibility of other states to push those flag states when they know that vessels flying those flags are not rescuing people. As I said in my presentation, we see kind of provisions in this regard in national law, but it's a provision that's almost never, at least as far as I'm aware, is almost never implemented. The other question, kind of talking about capacity of vessels to rescue, I think something that's worth keeping in mind as well is that very often this whole issue around kind of people being rescued and then disembarkation being delayed, etc., is made worse by the fact that a lot of vessels end up rescuing more people than they have crew, which raises issues and in some contexts excuses around kind of the security of the vessel and the ability of the vessel to rescue. How can we change that? I think again it should be up to flag states, but also for the international community to push those flag states. And we've seen pushes in other areas where the shipping industry has been involved. So IUU fishing, for example, is an area where we've seen quite a lot of pressure being put on certain states. And I think it's about time that we start looking at that sort of pressure from the international community in this area as well. And yeah, I mean, completely agreed on examples, both from within the kind of migration sphere in terms of trust funds, but also from other areas. Yeah, I think that's it.
Manon, do you want to come in?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. I heard someone else at the same time, I think, no?
No, just wondering which Manon are you referring to?
So I was initially referring to you, but the other Manon has now got her hand up. So let me pass over to her for now.
Okay, so to me then, Manon Barto, not the panelist. Yeah, yes. Okay, yes, great. No, just, well, I'm gonna try to put my video here. Yes, just to very briefly, because I'm aware that we're already running a bit behind and that many people want to come in. I just wanted to just add a few points. I work in the European External Action Service in the MENA Maghreb division, and I'm a policy officer on Libya. I very much agree with what also Mirko has said earlier, as well as some of the points raised by Vincent. Just to add a few things on our broader engagement in the Libyan context, I saw that there was a reference in the recommendations of the other men on the Berlin process. And I very much want to highlight that this is really a key focus of our engagement from the EU side on the UN-led peace process track, which is now called the Berlin process. And under this process, there is actually a working group focusing on human rights and international humanitarian law. And actually, the Swiss colleague who intervened earlier probably knows that Switzerland is co-chairing this working group together with the Netherlands and the UN. And the EU is very much a very strong participant and contributor to this process. And so I think that in the context of this, we are also advocating and reinforcing messages that can be brought up with our Libyan partners on a number of topics that we discussed and we addressed today, including on ending the system of arbitrary detention and developing alternatives to detention. Another area that I want to stress is also sanctions, something that we are also trying to step up our work. I just want to highlight here that actually in autumn last year, the EU implemented or adopted, let's say, new sanctions against 2 persons in Libya responsible for human rights violations and trafficking in human beings. And so to the extent possible, we also try to transpose EU sanctions on these, UN sanctions on these persons. And I think that this is something that we should really continue doing, because the impact on the ground has many researchers and organizations have shown that the impact on these activities has also been quite important. And perhaps one last point that I want to raise, and it's also a question to our colleagues from the media, because this is also something that they might want to have an input on. I'm aware that a lot of the discussions that we had today focused on people in detention. Now, I'm also aware of the fact that a lot of people in detention or held in detention conditions in Libya, that we don't have a perfect figure for that, because a lot of this is unaccounted for and in unofficial centers. But I do want to point out that it is minority of those migrants and refugees inside the country. And what I personally find is missing is also those positive stories of cases where migrants and refugees were integrated in different parts of Libya within the communities and when this worked. And I think I would be curious to hear the views of our journalist colleagues on that, but I do think that that's something that, you know, if we were able to do that a bit more, that hopefully that would be one of the other tools that we could, implement and use at our advantage to also change the narratives and the perceptions on the migration phenomena in Libya. Those are the few points and few thoughts I wanted to share. Thanks a lot. Over.
Thank you, Manon. Maybe before we turn to Annalisa, if Lucie wants to come in a bit, also there was a question posed to her earlier in the chat about maybe some of the channels for family reunification which MSF has been trying to use so far.
Yes, hi. So thanks for the question from Samuel Butrush regarding the family reunification. So indeed, some individual had applied, some family had applied in the third country and submitted for family reunification because we were in touch with some of their lawyers. However, as MSF, we do not have the capacity to ensure that each case is, and to follow up and to ensure that each cases have placed a request in the third country. What we do on our side is we only identify the cases with family link and we refer them with as much information as possible as we can collect to UNHCR Family Reunification Unit. And then they will conduct the necessary verification and the process. I hope that clarifies for that question. In regards to Manon mentioning just changing the narrative, honestly, we would love to change the narrative, but we are a bit short on very successful stories of migrant and asylum seeker safe and protected and integrated currently in Libya, as I think a lot of humanitarian organizations, not MSF, even I think UNHCR and IOM have recognized that that Libya is not a safe country. And I would say also that despite the large investment that is made from UTF that was presented just now, it's not a question about categorization. I think, or we think, it's a question of actual services. I think the categorization is something that is just hiding the lack of services. And yeah, so yeah, despite all the investment, there's not much result and there's a lot of gap still. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucie. I mean, maybe if I bring in Annalisa and Faraz to speak to maybe also the point Sylvain was making earlier about potentially unethical reporting and maybe also obviously the negative impact it has on your own reporting and work, but also this discussion about narratives and focus of some of the investigations which have happened. So maybe they are not with us anymore. No, maybe not. So, I mean, I will open up. Are there any other questions as well? And maybe, I mean, I thought the point earlier about the missing numbers also in terms of missing in the desert and the point Vincent also underlined of the importance of understanding what is happening lower down in the route, I mean, maybe speaking to a bit of work which is also going on in Sudan. And I think coming back to my own presentation this morning around Tigrayan, young Tigrayans I've been speaking to in the camps from Rakuba, some of whom have already made their way to Khartoum in the space of the last few weeks. Maybe some of the work which is happening there also to understand decisions people are making, but also how you can make sure that protection activities are also starting that early on in the process. I'll leave it if we want to open up to that discussion. Or maybe not. Given that we are running a bit late, yes, I'll pass over to Ayla. Thank you very much for all our panelists and for a very good discussion, which I hope lead to some concrete recommendations in the final session this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laetitia, for the outstanding moderation across such a vast array of advocacy issues. It was certainly a challenge. I realized that we are a bit over time and we do not want to shortchange those core attendees that have been tuning in for every panel with a much needed coffee break. So my recommendation is that we shift it by 10 minutes and we begin at 3:40 or 15:40 is when we will reconvene for the final wrap up. And I would ask that participants from this panel, and of course the panel at the start of the day, particularly the rapporteurs from both panels, to be present so that we can take the insights forward from both of your sessions. Big thank you to all of the panelists from this session and the very active engagement from all participants. And we shall see you on the other side of the coffee break. Over. Thank you.